Alright, so here's another installment of Honey Fix This if you can to save us some money, and I can. So, we're just going to have to put new pads on and turn the rotors. It's going to be $115 worth my time for what it's going to take me to do these, but Firestone wanted to do the rotors too, so they needed done. So I'm going to replace the pads and rotors myself, save myself about $200 over what a normal auto mechanic shop will charge us when they start changing the rotors out. They start charging a lot more money. So this is her 2013 CX5 all-wheel drive touring. So right now I've already got the lug nuts broken loose so that I can take them off the rest of the way once I jack the car up. You want to break them loose while you've got the car down though, so that the wheel is held in place just by the weight of the car. So let me jack the car up and get the wheel off and we'll see what we're looking at. Alright, so the wheel is off. I want to cover a couple of quick safety notes before we go any further. As you can see here, I've jacked the car up. I use the spare tire jack, comes with it. I don't have a floor jack, I'm too cheap. But the weight of the vehicle is not on that. It's on the jack stand here. For me, it's a safety thing. I also tend to put the tire or the wheel I've just taken off underneath the frame. The other thing you want to make sure is the parking brake is engaged, but also, and again, I'm overly safe, I throw a wheel chock underneath the back wheel opposite what I'm working on because of the way the car lifts. So, something that will help you in this process considerably is to turn the steering wheel the direction of the wheel or set of brakes you're working on as far as it'll go. It's going to give you more access to the bolts that we have to take out. So we're going to take a look at those real quick and I'll show you where those are at. And then I'll go ahead and take them off and we'll see what we got. So for those of you who haven't done this before, this is going to be your rotor here. The pads squeeze this, so it brings the car to a stop. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's a simple explanation. Your caliper here, this holds the caliper in place and your pads are underneath the caliper. Caliper is activated by pressure in the hoses. When you push the pedal, the brake fluid, which is under extreme pressure, closes that caliper, squeezing those pads around this rotor. So what happened with these is they got too hot at some point or just had a warp in them that we didn't notice till it got worse. And the rotor's got a warp. So we got 4 bolts we're going to take out to get to our pads on our rotor. Now, if you're just doing pads, you've only got 2, and it's really simple. So to get the pads out, let me see if I can get my light to cooperate a little bit here. So what we've got here is you've got a bolt here. Get back a little bit for reference, frame of reference, and a bolt here. These are the 2 bolts here that you need to take out if you're just doing the pads. You remove these 2 bolts, they slide out, and this piece pulls out completely, and you can remove the pads from the caliper. Now, if you got to take the rotor off, you've got to get this bracket off that holds the caliper in place as well. And there's 2 additional bolts, and those bolts, I don't know if we can see or not, are here, and then the other one is here. So once we get this bolt and this lower bolt off, these bolts off, the whole brake assembly will come off, and then this rotor, no longer, because I've changed these before, some of your rotors will have a retaining screw. I think this one did at one point here. This is your first time doing it, you might have one there. Take it out, you don't need to put it back in. The wheel actually holds the rotor in place, but the rotor should come right off. So I'm gonna get these 4 bolts out. If yours are stuck, you have problems, PB Blaster is a great thing to use. I have a cordless 1/4 inch impact driver that works really well for me. I love that tool. It's one of my favorite tools. It's great for when you're dealing with parts like this. Can very easily, from the heat, heating and cooling, just kind of start to seize over time and make those bolts tough to get out. So I'm gonna grab my 1/4 inch impact driver, get these 4 bolts out. We'll take everything apart and we'll have a look-see, and I'll show you how we go ahead and clean everything else out and put it back together. All right, so taking the 2 bolts out of the caliper, I wanted to take a second to show you what we're working with here. That's my 1/4 inch impact driver. I love that thing. So it's just a smaller, short bolt. It sits here in this carriage, and you'll see this gasket stays in place and it moves. That's what slides. This is what actually slides in and pushes and squeezes the caliper. So it allows the caliper to float and move a little bit. So I've got the other one loosened. Okay. Now these both came out pretty easy. The other side I had to use the PB Blaster, which, like I said, is this fantastic stuff. If you don't have this and you're doing work in your car, or on your car in your garage, or just about anything else around the house that gets stuck, this stuff is great for breaking upbound bolts, nuts, screws, so they can come loose and you can get them out without tearing them up. So I've got those out now. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove the caliper mechanism assembly here. Just give it a little wiggle and you'll see it kind of comes out. So this is a caliper assembly. It just kind of wiggles off. Now, it's attached by the hose. You want to be very careful. Do not strain that hose. Now, as you can see, that disc there on the right here, this is the cylinder that pushes the brakes. Now, it's a little bit out. To get new pads in there, we have to push this all the way back in. So what I use is a C-clamp, and I just clamp it down on this. You can actually run the threaded part right into the bottom of the caliper, clamping it down, and that'll push that all the way back in. So I'm going to do that in just a second. I'll show you what that looks like. I tend to hang the caliper from the shock tower, from the strut there, and then these here are your pads. Let me show you those. All right, so I've got my caliper assembly here, just kind of balanced up there by the strut. A little dangerous, I'm curious, but I'm not gonna be banging around too much right now. I'll get it moved before I do. So these are our pads, and these are sitting inside of this holder here. And there's little shims here. So all we're gonna do to get these out of here, and you want to take careful note of one very important thing. If you look here on the back of this, you'll see you get a tab here. This is a wear indicator. So as your brake pads start to get low, it'll squeal. That's what causes it. This is going to be on the upper spot of the inner pad. It's important to note that. Now, I will tell you a little trick. If you've gotten past the point, you haven't looked, and you're not listening to this video, and you don't rewind it, your pad's also going to have different wear marks. The outside of this here is an oval shape. The inner pad is round. I don't know how it is on other cars, but just the way the caliper assembly is built on this, you can deduce that from afterwards. If you forget to look and there's not a video for a different car you're working on, you might be able to. So to get these out, you're just gonna kind of wrestle them out of there, pull them out. Now, as you can see, I just did these brakes 2 years ago, and they got a hell of a lot of life left on the pads. But because the rotors are warped, it's gonna have affected the pads. So I'm gonna get rid of the pads. I'm replacing the pads and the rotors. There's no sense in not to. It's cheap enough, and for the amount of time that it would take me to take stuff apart later and replace pads in a year or two, or another year or so, I'm not going to mess with it. So this is your rotor assembly. Now, as you can see, it's not going to go anywhere right now because we've got to remove this bracket. So that's the next step. I'm going to do that now, and then I'll show you what that looks like. All right, so these are the ones that gave me a problem on the other side too. These caliper bolts, or these bracket bolts, the larger ones, are stuck. So I've soaked them with PB Blaster, let it drip down. I'm just using one of the piece of paper from the other pad that the new ones were wrapped on. The other side's already done. I'll let those soak for a minute. While I do, I want to talk about one quick thing with this. So with regard to the size sockets you need. So these on this here, on that bracket, those are going to be a 17 millimeter. To get the smaller ones on the actual one, the caliper bracket itself, I'm using a 9/16. So keep that in mind if that helps you guys knowing what tools it is that you need in advance. And I realize I probably could have given you that information in the beginning. Oh well. While we're waiting on this to soak, I'll give you a little bit more anatomy. So these are called a shim. They're a part of this carrier. My pads are a whole new pad kit. They came with new shims. So I'm going to get rid of these, and I can just pull them up off there. They're just a cheap, flimsy piece of metal. They're supposed to help prevent rattle in the pads. There's one on the top and one on the bottom. Now, on this car, and I don't know about how others are, but with this one, the thing I want to point out is this is the one I just pulled off the top, and this is the one off the bottom. They are a different shape if you look. It's important to make sure you get those right. So the top one has got these rounded or beveled corners. If you look, the bottom one is just got 90s almost. It's got a little bit of a bevel, I guess, but a much, much smaller bevel. The other thing you'll notice on the bottom one, see how this is open here on the end right here? On the top, you'll notice it's not. So it's important that you remember and you put the top shim and the bottom shim in the right places. They are different. So I'm going to give these bolts here another try now. The PB Blaster soaking a little bit, and we'll see if they're ready to go. All right, so they're both off, and they were a royal pain in the butt, which is typical. But you can see, I mean, I soaked it in PB Blaster. It's still dripping. I'm going to get a towel and clean this up a little bit. But they're off now. There's some monster bolts. I mean, these are no little bolts. There's some big boys. So, I mean, they're holding that thing in place. They get a little bound up. They're getting hot. They're cooling off. They're getting hot. They're cooling off. So it happens. So don't get frustrated. Just stay with it. A mini sledge or maul, 3-pound weight, works pretty well. If you've got a breaker bar and a good socket set, don't use some cheap Chinese crap. You're going to break the socket most likely if it's really that bound. If you can't get it with a 1/4-inch impact wrench, I was able to tap it loose pretty well and then finish it off with the impact wrench. So now, as you can see, I'll get some light back in here again. This rotor is just loose. It just literally will pull right off the front. Now, I'm not going to do it because I'll drop it on my foot because I'm a klutz and I really don't need to do that. So I'm going to take the rotor off, get it out of the way, clean up this PB blaster mess, get the other rotor. I'm going to spray it off with the brake cleaner because you want to make sure, and I'm going to wash my hands. You don't want any grime or grease on your brake rotors or pads. So I'm going to wash my hands, get them good and clean after I clean this stuff up a little bit. Spray down my rotors with a brake cleaner, let it dry off, put them on carefully, handling only the outside part. So again, it's not to avoid any real contact with the braking surface itself. And then I will put everything back together, and we'll show you what that looks like, and I'll show you how the pads go in and putting the shims on those and getting that all set up. All right, so a couple quick things. There's a new rotor. I've sprayed it down. I'm gonna let it drip dry. And you may think, hey, it's a new rotor. As long as I don't touch it, I'm good. That's not true. They put a protective grease on most of them that I've ever bought. You don't want that on there when you put them on. So use a CRC brake cleaner, brake parts cleaner, and clean it, spray it off. It'll dry. You'll be good to go. Now, I did mention the other thing. We've got to push that clamp back in. I'm going to show you that caliper piston back in, so I'm going to show you how to do it. So like I said, I use a 4-inch C-clamp. Now, I figured out a trick this time. It took me long enough. Done brakes a few different times. I've got a piece of steel laying around. Just a 3/8 inch, I believe. Folded steel from Home Depot, just a piece of scrap. So if you put the clamp directly on, what ends up happening is this piece here of the clamp ends up pushing down like, I don't know, this far or this far. I mean, you're screwing it down forever to get that caliper all the way back in. However, if I lay this piece of metal across the top of that piston, it doesn't have to push down very far, and it just saves me a little bit of time. It's a little bit easier. So I'll see if I can show you how I do that, what I'm talking about. If I can't, well, you'll figure out the trick like I did eventually. All right, so I'm a nice guy. I'm going to try and help you. You see that there? That's what I'm talking about. That's the inside of the piston. And what happens is, right in here, what ends up happening then is your C-clamp, your threaded part of your C-clamp is way down in there, and it just takes forever. So I'm going to lay that metal piece, don't fall, please, sweetie. I'm going to lay that metal piece across here and clamp right on top of it. And that'll push the piston in. That's what I'm going to do. So you see, this is how I'm doing it. Rather than letting this piece go all the way down into the piston, I'm just going to block it across the top. Now you're going to have to really crank down, hold your caliper assembly so it doesn't fall as you're doing this, and crank it down until it stops. It will stop. It's going to move slow. It's a little tough because you're pushing back brake fluid through the system. Some people take the brake fluid reservoir cap off. I've heard mixed opinions on it. I don't do it because I'm a klutz or forgetful. I'd probably forget to put it back on and I'd have all kinds of problems. So I don't do it, but that's me. All right, so that part's done. As you can see, that piston is now flush and back in there, and that's important because otherwise your pads are going to be thicker because they're new. The piston stays out because the pads are wearing. That's the amount of wear on your pads, minus a little. But if you don't have that push all the way back in, odds are you're going to have a real hard time getting your assembly back together. Which I'm going to take this old rotor off now and show you one last trick that I use because of where I live in the Midwest, where we get a lot of nasty, salty, wet winters. All right, so the rotor's off. You can see the wheel hub assembly here now. This is the trick I want to show you, something I do because I live in the Midwest. A friend of mine told me this when I first started doing these things. So I use this. This is a Napa brand. It's just a Permatex anti-seize lubricant. Mix it up real good. Got a built-in brush, and I will brush it on this part here. That's where the rotor meets the hub. And on the back side, there's contact. And what I've had happen in the past with some of my older vehicles is that rotor gets real stuck, depending on how long it's on there. What ends up happening then is you end up having to take a sledge or a maul like the one I used earlier to get the nut loose, just to get the rotor to let loose off of this, because they basically rust to one another. Again, that's a matter of heat, cool, and then also just the nasty, salty winters that we get here in the Midwest. So I'm not going to let that happen with this one. Instead, I'm going to coat it in Permatex, which will anti-seize lube, or anti-seize lubricant, which will keep that next new rotor from sticking to the wheel hub when the time comes that it needs to be replaced, whether it's me or somebody else. So I'm going to put that rotor back on, and then I'm going to start putting the other stuff back together. We'll do that step by step as well. All right, so the rotor's back on. Now, a little trick I use, I take one of the wheel lugs, and I'll put it on one of the bottom-most pins. It keeps the rotor from wanting to kick out on you. Otherwise, it wants to kind of do this, and it can be a real pain to work with because it's not held in place. This will just at least hold it in place while you work and put the brake assembly back together. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take a steel bristle brush, clean this up just a little bit and where the shims go, and then we will go ahead and put the new shims on, and we'll put the bracket back on there, and I'll show you that in just a second. All right, so there they are. The new shims are on. They just literally will snap in place. What ends up happening, you'll see, is that metal piece goes over that little dimple there. Again, top's on the top, bottom on the bottom. You're good to go. Keep in mind, just in case you forgot, make it easy. Pistons that you see there go on the inside. So there's your top, rounded edges like we looked at, and there's your bottom. And it's going to go right on. I've cleaned this up a little bit. I think I'm going to clean off a little bit more, and I'll put it on with the bolts, and I'll show you how we put the pads in. All right, so that's back on. So keep in mind that, remember, the pistons go on the inside, and then they go on further away from the center of the axle, so that you've got the bracket part where you screw it in there. And so those bolts are back in place now. It's dark back there. I'm not going to turn the light back on. You saw where they came out from. The shims are in place now. You can see that we're lined up. There's a pretty low glow. So we've got plenty of gap there between the pad, where the pads are going to be in the rotor for the shims. I'm going to put just a little bit of the anti-squeal grease that comes with it on the ends of the pads that sit in these grooves, just to prevent any kind of squeal or rattle. Just helps keep a nice quiet braking system, because otherwise I'll have another honey-do list, and I'd rather get to a honey done. So I'm going to put those together. So what we've got here, and we'll take a quick look at the pads. These pads are a ceramic pad, and what we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit of anti-squeal grease here on the back of this, where the piston contacts it, where it would rub, potentially make noise, and then these are the tabs that slide into place. Now, on this particular car and these pads, there's no difference in the inner and outer pad. What is different is we're going to have to add that wear tab back onto the pad, and it's going to slide over the corner. You'll see on these, there's little notches, okay? Those notches are where that wear pad, so that wear indicator just slides on. So figure out which pad you're going to put on the inside, because that's where the wear indicator came from, and put it on the inside pad, upper, that wear indicator. And I'll show you what that looks like once it's on. So that's your wear indicator. And what you're going to do is this little groove here, that you see right there, is going to slide onto that pad and clamp down. I'll show you what that looks like once it's on. I don't have enough hands to do it and hold the camera, so oh well, low tech. All right, so there it is. It just slides right on over that, as you can see. And you'll know that you did it right, because if you look at your pad you took off, they're going to look the same, okay? All right, so we're going to put this inner pad back on now. You'll notice, remember those grooves we looked at here and here where I said put the grease? I've got the grease on there. That's where these tabs line up. So I'm going to do it on the front one on the inner one first. Let's see if I get a little bit of light in here and make it easier for you guys to see. So what I tend to do, and I find is easiest, is I put it into the top first, so I can push up on that shim if it's coming down some. And then I line up that bottom tab. Easier said than done. I'm going to have the tab on all the way. It's hard to see here. Hold the camera. Give me a second. Okay, so on this side, it was easier to start from the bottom. On the other side that I did before, it was easier to start from the top. But I'll show you again, and we'll do it with the outer pad. All right, so here we go. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put it in this bottom tab here. And this is a little bit trickier because we got that bracket in the way there. But start from the outside, put it in that bottom tab, slide it just past, and then you can see I've gotten it lined it up here. And this is going to want me to start from the bottom. There we go. I got it pushed in. Push it right back against it. So now both of my pads are on there against the rotor. The only thing left to do now is to put the caliper assembly back in place with those two bolts, and then put the wheel back on. Don't forget to take this little lug you got off if you use that trick. The last thing I would tell you to do is make sure that you put a little bit of grease, typically it comes with a brake kit, on those smaller pins that came out that go in the caliper, just to make it easier as they slide through that rubber boot. And then we'll do one last check before we're done. All right, so the assembly is all back together. New rotors and pads are on both sides. All in all, not too bad. So the last thing you'll need to do, if you took the brake fluid reservoir cap off, put it back on. Make sure you don't get any brake fluid on your clothes. That's the other reason I don't take it off. That stuff is nasty. I've seen it eat through a leather jacket in seconds. Then what you're going to want to do, once you get the wheel put back on and you get your lug nuts all tightened back up, you're going to want to obviously make sure they're tightened on the ground as well. Go around in an alternating pattern, crisscrossing. Get your car safely down on the ground. Once you've done that, take the emergency brake off. You're going to, leaving the car in park, unless you've got a standard, in which case leave the emergency brake on. You're going to want to depress that brake pedal a few times. It's going to go to the floor real quick and easy the first time, a little less with each push. Just depress that brake pedal a few times to the floor until it feels normal like it does. Different brake manufacturers for different types of brakes have different types of braking instructions. Best advice that I typically have given my wife is take it easy on the new brakes so they brake in about 500 miles. Try to avoid any major sudden stops, obviously. Give yourself plenty of stopping distance. That helps with that. And that's it. Take it easy on the brand new brakes. Enjoy being able to stop safely, and we'll chalk this one up to a honey done list now. Thanks, guys.